All right, so last week, Tony Salva kicked us off a new series called Dear Church. And we're walking through this series called Dear Church over the next month. And the whole purpose of this series is we're walking through this small but crazy impactful book in the New Testament called Philippians. And what this is a letter written to a church in Philippi. So they were the Philippians, written by this guy named Paul. And Paul was this guy who was completely against Jesus, completely against his followers, but came to know and follow Jesus and spent the remaining of his life helping others, starting churches, and helping them follow Jesus too. And a lot of the New Testament are these letters that Paul wrote to these churches and individuals in that area, helping them understand how to know and trust and follow Jesus and how to live and function as a church. And so this is what we're doing with Dear Church. We're walking through the book of Philippians in the New Testament. And as he's writing this, Paul is actually a prisoner in Rome when he wrote this letter to the church in Philippi. And he used this letter to instruct them on how to live as a Christian no matter what the circumstances are. And that was the purpose of his letter. And the reason we're looking at this book as a church is because far too often when people come in contact with the church, a church, doesn't have to be one church, any church, they don't have an experience of how Paul's instructing the church in the Philippians to actually live out. They experience something different. They experience judgment, or they feel like they don't belong. And so what we're doing with this series is purposely looking at Philippians for the next few weeks to look at, hey, this is how a church is supposed to look. This is how it's supposed to function. And last week, Tony kicked it off and did a great job of talking about how a church is supposed to be together, a community, a family, based off loving each other and loving the people around them because of how much God loves them through Jesus Christ. And so that's how we kicked it off last week, and today we're going to continue that off. And the reason I asked you to talk about your best friends today, because I want to share you a story of me and my best friend. Now, my best friend to this very day is a guy named Dale Lippin. And Dale and I met when we were in the 6th grade. When we first met each other, we did not like each other at all. You see, I was this small, skinny, kind of pipsqueak of a kid in 6th grade who had a paper route. And each day after school, I'd pick up my papers, get my paper, carry on, and walk around our neighborhood delivering the papers of the houses that had a subscription with our local newspaper. And each day in 6th grade, in the fall, I noticed that I would walk by this guy that was a little taller than me, a little bigger than me, and had this face that it looked like he could kill somebody. He just looked angry at all times. He wasn't happy. You looked at him, you're like, okay, this guy doesn't look nice. And so each day I look at this guy and he's taller than me, and this ends up being Dale. So I'm not like trying to hide it. This is Dale, who's now my best friend. Dale had an early growth spurt, so he was just taller as a 6th grader, and I was a little shorter at that point. So here I'm small, I'm skinny, carrying this paper bag, delivering, and he's walking back with his backpack on. So at that point we didn't go to the same school, and I just at all times tried to avoid eye contact with him because I looked at him and thought, this guy looks mean. He looks like he's a jerk. Looks like he'd want to punch me if I even said hi to him. And so every day I'd walk by him and just look down like this and wouldn't talk to him and just avoid him at all costs. And then a couple of months later, at my local elementary school, at the playground, Dale shows up at the same basketball court I'm playing with. And I'm thinking, this is it. He found out where I play basketball, and now he's going to pummel me. He's been waiting for this moment. Because just looking at his face, he just looks angry, and still does to this day. I tell him, dude, you just look angry. That's why people don't like you. But so we start playing basketball. We find out that actually we're the same exact age by a month. He just happened to have an early growth spurt, and I was still catching up to him. Now I'm taller than him, and it's great. But Dale has this evil look to him. We're playing basketball, and we start talking to each other. We find out that he just transferred elementary schools, and now we go to the same school together. And I found out that he is actually in the same class as me starting that following Monday. And I'm thinking, okay, now this angry-looking dude's going to be in my class. How do I handle this? And very quickly, I started to learn, okay, I need to figure out what to do with this guy because he lives 2 houses from me. We're playing on the same basketball court. He's going to be in the same class as me. Do I just avoid him? Do I stop talking to him? What do I do? Because this guy just seems mean. And so 2 weeks in the class, we're in the same classroom together, Dale decides to pick a fight with our classroom bully. I look over, and Dale and this dude named Nathan, and Nathan was just a jerk to everybody. They fought, and my instant reaction was, I need to humble myself and be friends with Dale right away. This is a good move for me. This is going to play well for me in the future. And so I start talking to Dale, and then as lo and behold, as we continued and kind of talked and kind of figured each other out, I found out that Dale hated me as well. Because he looked at me as he was walking by this pathetic-looking paper boy, this guy looks like he's 2 years old, he's quiet, he looks weak. I'm not going to talk to this guy looks pathetic. And so we had these preconceived notions about each other that caused us to not want to talk to each other at all. But when you live by each other, when you play the same sports together, when you are in the same classroom together, you have to figure out, am I going to talk to them or not? And to actually do that, I probably have to get over myself and figure out what this guy is all about. And that happened with Dale and I together because we had these thoughts about each other just that maybe were true on the outside but weren't really true in reality. And so we started kind of humbling each other and saying, okay, here's who I am, here's who you are. And to this day, Dale and I are very best friends. Like, I am the godfather of his children. He was the best man at my wedding. He's the only guy outside of my family that I routinely call to talk to on the phone because he lives in South Carolina. We talk a lot. We hang out whenever we can. We're in each other's towns. We are best friends. We have amazing conversations together. We play sports together. We are now dads together. It's amazing. And that never would have happened if I just believed that he was just this mean-looking dude, because he still is, and just wouldn't have talked to him. And it never would have happened for him if he didn't get over the fact that I looked like this a small weakling who wasn't fun to hang out with. We never would have became best friends. And a lot of times that's what happens with relationships. You see, a lot of times what prevents life-changing relationships from happening is because there are experiences and beliefs about the other person or other party or other organization that makes us not even want to build a relationship with them. Never has that been even more true now today than with the church and the rest of the world. I don't know if you've ever noticed, but maybe you have, maybe you haven't, but when you bring up the idea of church or faith to people who aren't connected with it, it gets really uncomfortable. Maybe it gets uncomfortable for you even when someone brings up church or faith or religion. Christianity or anything like that can lead to a lot of apprehension, a lot of skepticism, and sometimes just animosity towards it because there's this broken relationship between the church and other people. Less and less people are connected to a church today. In fact, in America right now, there are 156 million people in America that have no connection to a church where they live. Maybe they used to at one point, but not anymore. They see the church as unloving, judgmental, harmful, hurtful, and not a group of people where they experience the love and grace that is supposed to be accompanying a church because of who Jesus is. And maybe you're here today, maybe that's been your experience in the past. That you've tried church, you've gone to church, and it hasn't been a place where you experience a place like you belong, or you can explore a place that you are loved, and a place that you experience grace and relationships. Now, some of this is because the church has been unloving, judgmental, and hurtful, and not a group to help people and others experience who Jesus is. And that's just the honest truth. Sometimes as churches, we don't do that very well. This is a problem because this is God's plan to help the world know and experience who he is through Jesus. When we read the Bible in the New Testament, especially when you're looking at the New Testament, you have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Those are like the stories of Jesus' life. And everything after that is the history of the church and how they're supposed to live out being the church in that day and age. And so most of the New Testament is about how the church is supposed to be, how they're supposed to function, and how we're supposed to live out being the church today as well. When we read that in the New Testament, we see that people are coming to faith in Jesus. People are experiencing love. People are experiencing grace. And thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people were coming to Jesus constantly in Scripture because of how the church was living. And so that's what we see in the Bible. But then on the flip side, we often hear from other churches and how the world is going to hell in a handbasket. America has lost its way and Christianity is under attack. And so the reaction is to hunker down and focus on themselves. And that's the completely wrong way to look at it. Because in the New Testament, we see the church being this crazy, outward-focused group of people that was so full of love, so focused on Jesus' mission, they went out of their way to make sure they could connect with everybody they possibly could. But now people experience church in some ways where the church is like, you know what? Everything's messed up. Everything's broken. Let's just leave the world to themselves. We'll just focus on themselves right here. But never do we see in the Bible that the church is supposed to just focus on themselves. Never. The church is supposed to be this human body of people that show and help people experience who God is through the love of Jesus. And so there's this tension between the church and people who aren't connected with the church because of experiences, because of preconceived notions, because of whatever brokenness lies in between there. And because of that, a relationship isn't taking place all the time. And that's causing mistrust, that's causing brokenness, and that's causing a real authentic relationship that God calls us to with other people to not happen. See, the problem is too often the church is just expecting everyone else to change and act like we should act. The government, the people, the culture, the morals should all just be what the church believes and everything will be good. But honestly, that's just pride that gets in the way of how the church should function. A lot of times in my life, I have sat as a pastor, I've been involved with the church, and I just expect everyone who has no relationship with God, no connection with Jesus, to say, you know what, if you just act the way I act, everything will be good. That's pride. That's not the right way of thinking. And Paul sees this as he's talking to people. He's talking to people in his culture and writing these letters. He's saying, no, listen, this is how we're supposed to live. This is how we're supposed to act. And this is why we're doing this series, because we want to be a church that connects with other people, people who are far from God, who have no relationship with God. And maybe that's who you are as you're sitting here today. We want to be a church that connects with you in a way that's loving, in a way that brings grace, in a way that brings life, because that's what Jesus came to bring. And so the reason we're doing this series is to wrestle with that tension. And the question we want to wrestle with today is, how should a church live and engage the world around us? See, much of Paul's writing in the New Testament were to other churches instructing them how to live, to think, and the way to act. And that was exemplified in the way that Jesus lived. Everything that Paul wrote, it always came back to who Jesus was and what Jesus did. And when Jesus left this planet, he commanded his followers to go and make more followers and to teach people everything that Jesus had taught them in the first place. And so their job was to go find people who don't know Jesus. Jesus is like, listen, this is your job. Go meet people. Go build relationships with people. Tell them about me. Teach them about me. Teach them to live in the way that I've taught you to live. And go make more followers of me. And those followers that you make, have them go make more followers and them make more followers, because that is the way we rescue and restore the world. This is our mission. It was never about just staying focused on yourselves. Because if the early followers of Jesus, if all they did was focus on themselves, the church wouldn't exist today. But here we are existing as a part of the big church, as one church, because of other people looking out for other people to share about Jesus with them. So in Paul's letter to the Philippians, he first encourages them that no matter what happens to them, to not give up and to focus on following Jesus' mission out of love. It's all about Jesus first and foremost, not lose sight of that. That's part of what Tony talked about last week. But then he addresses the attitude in which they are to live that out and how that impacts other people. This right here, I believe this attitude that we should have of a church that we're going to wrestle with today, this is one of the most important things that we as a church and across the world has to pay attention to, because if we start getting this right, I believe as a church, both here in Chartiers Valley and churches across our city, across our country, things will start changing. We'll start being the church that God calls us to be. And he says this first in Philippians 2, verses 1 through 4. Paul writes this. He says, therefore, if any of you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, if any comfort from his love, if any common sharing in the Spirit, if any tenderness and compassion, then make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit and of one mind. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourself, not looking to your own interest, but each of you to the interest of the others. So Paul writes to this group of Christians that if they have any connection with Jesus, any hint of relationship with Jesus, any encouragement because of who Jesus is and what he's done and the relationship that they have with him, any commonality with others who believe in Jesus as well, and just simply have that compassion for one another, he says this, any connection with Jesus at all, then be one. Be united, be of the same mind and the same focus and the same mission. Paul tells them to be one in spirit and in mind, to be united for the cause of Jesus, to love God and to love people. He then says to do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but to value others above ourselves. Paul says that in a person's life and in a church's following of Jesus, it's not about looking to our own interests, but actually to the interests of others. It's not about me. It's about them as we're loving everybody else. We're loving each other. It's not about my focus on myself and my own needs and my own desires. It's about how I live and relate to other people. I should look to their interests and look to love them. You see, what happens is this is where we struggle when it comes to following Jesus, I think. You see, we like the idea of Jesus. We can believe that our lives are better with him in it, but when it's that time to trust in Jesus, when our faith in him impedes our own comfort and impedes our own lifestyles and impedes the way we think and the way we act, that's when things get a little difficult. You see, we like Jesus when he helps us personally, but Jesus gets really difficult when he asks us to go impact other people's lives. And that's where a breakdown can happen a lot of times in our faith. Because it's never meant to just be something between me and God. God changes my life through Christ, and then that overflows into the relationships I have in my homes, in my workplace, in the coffee shops I go to, wherever I go. That should change that as well. We like the idea of Jesus, but we get uncomfortable when that idea of Jesus impedes the life that we want. Now, none of us willingly admit that we're selfish in that regard. None of us like to say, you know what, yeah, I'm selfish. I don't like helping other people. I don't like loving other people. I don't like serving other people. That's just not my thing. No one just readily admits that. But the truth is, this is something we all struggle with, because something we're really, really good at from being a baby up until we die is we are naturally just selfish creatures. We want what's good for us. We want what's going to benefit us first and foremost, but that's the truth. We are all selfish to an extent. We want what we want. We have our own goals. We have our own dreams. And in that paradigm, we can let selfishness lead the way on those things if we're not careful, especially when it comes to our faith. Why? Because that's our natural desire. The person we normally think of in most situations, first and foremost, is ourselves. We think of our own comfort, we think of our own desires, we think of our own ambitions. Now, things can change that, of course. Like being in a relationship and getting married, that changes selfishness a little bit. First of all, it shows you how selfish you are when you first get married. You're just like, oh man, like I'm a broken mess because everything I want in my life is about me. And then I get married. I'm supposed to, enjoy this life with somebody else. And Danielle and I just celebrated our 10-year anniversary this past week. And I've learned over 10 years, I'm still pretty selfish. I'm still trying to figure this stuff out. We just went on vacation. And something I notice I do all the time is when I'm driving, I get to pick out whatever we listen to. Like it's mine. I don't even give Danielle an option. Like, nope, this is mine. I'm driving. And it's just revealed to me, I'm really selfish in that situation. And I'm selfish in so many other situations, but our relationship can show us how selfish we are and help us become less selfish. It can help change us and bring humility to our lives. That's one thing relationships can do. Another thing is have a kid. If you want to see how selfish you are, have a kid. Now, don't just go willingly have a kid, but if you ever have a child, it's going to show you all the selfish tendencies you have in your life. Now, don't get me wrong. When you're a parent, there's nothing you wouldn't do for your child. You'd lay your life down for them. You love them. You serve them. You do whatever. But man, you know what? If that kid wakes up one more time in the middle of the night, I'm going to lose my mind. Because it's all about my sleep, my comfort, my rest. We want those things to be comfortable for us. And so those kids drive us nuts. And so it shows our selfishness and it shows us areas of need, because naturally as people, as humans, we have a selfish desire. And it's because of that starts to infiltrate our own faith and infiltrate the way we live as a church, and that can lead to a lot of brokenness between us as a church and the people who aren't connected to a church. But this is who we are. We have those selfish moments, we have those selfish tendencies, but Paul is addressing this because he knows of our selfish tendencies, and more importantly, he knows that following Jesus and being the church has to mean that those tendencies die so that God's vision becomes a reality. What God calls us to do as a church, it's never going to work completely if pride and selfishness keep getting in the way of that. And so one of the things Jesus taught continually and showed and exemplified was that it wasn't about being prideful, it was about being humble and giving up your own rights, your own comforts for the sake of others to show them who God is, for them to experience His love and grace. God's vision is of being like-minded people in our humility to love and serve one another. It's not about us. It's about Jesus and it's about others. If we claim any part of Jesus, then we look to live not for ourselves, but we place others about ourselves. And this is what Paul writes to the church in Philippi, and this is still relates to us here today. Now, I think if we walked into every church in Pittsburgh, those churches would all agree with this. All of us as a collective church would agree, yeah, we should look out for other people's interests. We should serve one another. We should love one another. It sounds good. It sounds right. Humility is a good thing. We all agree on this. Unity, we're all for it. The problem is, it's not what the world experiences when they come in contact with the church all the time. It's not the reality that people are meeting. David Kinnaman is the president of the Barna Group. It's an organization that does research and produces research and resources to help people understand faith and culture across the world, and how people connect to different religions and things like that. And David and his organization has been noticing and paying attention to this great decline in people connecting with faith in the church in the past couple decades. Kinnaman says this about non-Christians. Non-Christians' biggest complaints about the faith are not immediately theological. Jesus and the Bible get relatively good marks. Rather, he sees resentments as focused on perceived Christians' attitudes. He says that Christians are viewed as too judgmental, too hypocritical, too political, and that is pushing people away. It's not our faith in Jesus that turns people away. It's our attitude and how we live that out. And so we see this amazing, huge decline in people connecting with the faith. I did youth ministry for almost 10 years. And a stat that always bothered me, always threw me off, is that every student that would come through our youth ministry, and they would, start from like middle school, go through junior high, and graduate through high school, and they went through the whole gambit, all those years. 8 out of 10 of them, 80% of them, up to that many, would walk away from their faith within a couple years of leaving high school. And made me think, what are we doing wrong? And the issue is, it never was, people like Jesus. People are attracted to Jesus. Jesus is amazing. People are intrigued and want to know more and explore more of who God is and who Jesus is. The problem is, his messengers have this amazing ability to mess it up sometimes with our attitudes. We get too prideful. We get too judgmental. We get too political in things, no matter what side of the aisle it's on. We let other things become more important than the love and grace of Jesus Christ, and that impacts the relationships that we have with people around us. And for so many reasons, Christians and churches have created this attitude around, and it turns people away. We think we have it all figured out. We pass judgment without really knowing the people and what they're dealing with. We say one thing, but we live out something completely different. And the worst part for me is this. I know personally I am guilty of creating and living out this attitude that pushes people away from Jesus. As I was writing this talk, I was more convicted and messed up by it because I realized I am just as guilty, if not more guilty, of creating that culture sometimes. Because I like to think I have it all figured out, that I have all the answers. And if people just follow me and follow the way I live, everything will be perfect then. But I help with that culture. So maybe it's time for an attitude check. Maybe it's time we start thinking about how do we live as a church, how do we live as individuals to help people experience the true love and grace that God comes to give through his son, Jesus. And Paul addresses that. Right after he says, by looking to others' interests and don't put yourself above others, but put their interests above yours, he says this. In Philippians 2, 5-8, he says, in your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who being in the very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. Paul writes this and says, listen, this is Jesus. He's God. But he didn't take equality with God something that we'd understand. He didn't take it as something that would be used to his advantage. Instead, he humbled himself, became a man, and lived as a servant here on this earth. I think what's amazing with this, if we're going to follow Jesus, Paul says, then we live as Jesus lived. And he breaks down in these verses of how Jesus lived. The first thing Jesus did is he put others first. Jesus was and is God. He needs nothing. He needs nothing from us. He created the universe and had the power to do whatever he wanted to. So if he wanted to, he could have came to earth, created this huge spectacle to show people that he was God, and essentially just say, follow me. If not, this is your own loss. But that wasn't God's nature, and that wasn't the way of Jesus. So instead, Jesus' attitude led him to know that being God wasn't something to be used for his own advantage or something that people would fully understand. And so what he did is he made himself nothing. He took on the nature of a servant. Why? Because he didn't come for himself. He came for the people. He came to build that relationship back between us and God. So Jesus came with this humble attitude. So going into it, he knew that he had to live in a different way. Jesus put others first. The second thing he did is he served. Instead of showboating around, showing his power, he lowered himself to be a servant. He was a human just like us. Jesus, God in the flesh, was just like you and me in that he walked, he slept, he ate, and the God of the universe spent his time on this earth serving others by healing them, by washing his closest friends' disgusting, dirty feet. He hung out with the people who were marginalized in his society. He looked out for the interests of others, not his own. He spent his time serving other people. This is God. And the way God said, hey, you want to know who I am? Look at my son. And his son spent his time serving other people. Not showboating, not bragging about how he had it all figured out. It wasn't arrogance and selfishness that led Jesus. It was humility. And humility is not something that we value a lot in our culture. Pride's a big deal in our culture. Humility's not. And Jesus came and lived in a way that was humble, and he served. So he put others first, he served, and he sacrificed. The attitude that led him to serve in the greatest way possible, he laid down his life for us. He was God who created the world and people that governed it, but he humbled himself to their authority, even when they put him to death on the cross. Now, when Paul says here, he says he became obedient to death, even death on a cross. He was emphasizing the humiliation that came with that type of death. You see, death on a cross was not some private, quick death. It was the Roman government's way of humiliating anyone that would threaten their power. So Jesus didn't come to overthrow the Roman Empire, but they took it as that. And when he was sentenced to death on the cross, it was this sentencing to say, you're going to die in the most humiliating way possible because we view you as a potential threat to our empire. We view you as someone who could take away the power and everything that we worked so hard for. So they put him to death on the cross. You see, death on a cross meant that Jesus was nailed to a cross in a public place so he could die a slow, painful death while other people walked by and made fun of him, agitated him, mocked him. And Jesus didn't have to do that. But he did it because his attitude was for others, not for himself. This is who Jesus was, and this is how he lived, and this was his attitude. And Paul says that we as a church should have the same attitude. We as individuals who claim to follow Jesus should have that same attitude. You see, too often the church is seen as something that is arrogant, judgmental, hurtful, legalistic, prideful, and selfish. And whether intentionally or not, our attitude is not one that invites people to explore God, but pushes them away. And if that has been your experience ever, when it came to churches or people who claim to follow Jesus, if that's been your experience where you've come across them and you felt judged, you felt like you didn't belong, you felt like this wasn't your place, I want to take a moment to apologize. If church and faith has been something that you've been pushed away from because you felt like you weren't worthy of God's love, I'm sorry for that. That's not our intention. That's not the goal as a church. Now, I'm not even saying this is a one church thing, because we're only 4 months old, so hopefully we haven't agitated to push people away just yet. I know we will the longer we get, because we're messed up, broken people. But for 4 months, hopefully we're doing okay. But I know it's happened. And it's happened to you. Made you walk away and say, I want nothing to do with that. If this is who God is based off how they're living and acting and treating me, I want nothing to do with that, God. If that's how the experience that you've had, I'm sorry for that. We need an attitude check sometimes, and hopefully this is giving you a fresh perspective of who God is with your connection with us. Our attitude should be like that of Jesus, and too many times it's not. We as Christians and we as churches can feel like we have it all figured out. We have it all put together. We have all the answers. And when we do that, we push people away. And if that's been you, again, I'm sorry. Listen, we may not agree with everything. We may not see things the same way, but that should never lead us as a church to be something that pushes anybody away and pushes them away from the community that God is calling us to be. And that's what we've done far too often. We've created different denominations because we disagree with so many little things. We've elevated certain sins above others to make those ones more important than the other ones, to make ourselves more comfortable with certain things and make other people feel more guilty. We've justified things that go against what Jesus teaches for our own selfishness, our own pride, and for our own comfort. See, the church has had an attitude problem, and I've been a part of that. So we need it adjusted. And we are prayerfully and faithfully trying to do that as a church here as One Church. And there's other churches in Pittsburgh and the Chartiers Valley area that are doing the same things. And we're so thankful that we can be on mission with them as well. But we have to make that decision and choose to do that as individuals and for us as a church as well. So it's important for us to check our attitude. Why? Number one, for our own personal faith and our own understanding of the gospel. You see, at the end of the day, this idea of humility that Paul talks about and saying this is the attitude that we should have. First and foremost, it starts with our own relationship with God. For us to be someone as an individual who claims to follow Jesus, we don't go to God with pride and selfishness and saying, hey, God, I think you're going to be able to just help my life, so go ahead and just jump in here. Do what I need you to do. Here's my list of things I need you to take care of. And if you do that, man, we'll make a good team together. That's not how faith in God works. But far too often, that's how we treat him. In our prayer life, it's a list of things we want God to do. Our lives are based, our relationship with God is usually based off of with how well things are going or not. That is not what faith in God looks like. See, the first step to Jesus is always humility. Always. If you ever just want a fun exercise to do in Scripture, pick one of the Gospels. Pick John. I'll just make it easy. Read the book of John. And pay attention to every interaction that Jesus has with people. There's a common theme. The ones that Jesus rebukes, the one that he is harshest to, the ones that he's like kind of giving a kick and saying, you guys, you gotta get this stuff figured out, is always the ones that come to him with pride and selfishness, and the ones that say, we have it all figured out, who do you think you are? But the ones that Jesus brings life to, the ones that he shows a ton of grace to and forgiveness to, are the ones that come to him with their first step of humility. The ones that recognize, I need help. I've messed up, I'm broken, I've sinned, I'm a sinner. God, I need your help. That first step to Jesus is always humility. Nothing else. And when we do that, we find grace, we find forgiveness, we find life found only in Jesus. That's what he came to do, and that's what he came to give us. And so the reason this humility thing is so important for us, it's so important for our own personal faith and understanding who God is more and more. And it's important for us to understand this, not just for us as individuals, but for the sake of the world and the people around us. Pittsburgh is a crazy religious city, traditionally. I mean, just drive around this amazing city and look at the gorgeous churches that are all around here. They're amazing. They're awesome. And you talk to anybody, there is some sort of religious background to them. They grew up in a Catholic church or a Lutheran church or some other church down the road, and they went to church with their parents or their grandparents, and they were confirmed or whatever that may be. There is a huge religious traditional background here, and it's awesome. It's wonderful. But it's become, like a lot of things, it's become tradition. It's not something that's real. It's not something that's relevant. And if you drive around the city and you look at a lot of those buildings, they're empty right now. There's no one going. In fact, within the next year, there's going to be a lot of church buildings because of all the consolidating that some churches are doing. They'll just be left empty or they're going to try to sell them because there's no one going and connecting. And part of that is because we have this broken relationship as a church and the people are not going to do a church. And for us to change that, we have to change our attitude. That's why this is so important. People are moving away from the church. People are moving away from faith. People are moving away from God for lots of reasons. And we're called as a church to build those gaps with them. We planted this church. We planted one church. There was a lot of people that thought starting a new church in our religious climate was actually a crazy idea to do. Like, why start something? Like, the idea of starting something new, you should do it when, like, the culture's hot with that idea. Like, when you're, like, you know, the big thing right now is, like crazy, like burgers and things like that. IHOP went to IHOB for, like, a month because burgers are a big deal or whatever. And so, like, let's make this awesome burger joint because everyone's all about burgers in our culture. Or bacon. Bacon's on everything, whatever it may be. Strike while the iron's hot. That's how you should do marketing. That's how you should do a business. That's how you should start something new. So why start a church when more and more people in our world, and especially in our country, are going away from the church? That doesn't make sense. Well, that's exactly why we started the church. It's for people who don't have a church to connect to. Lots of people thought starting it was a weird idea. Maybe some people thought it was a stupid idea. There's even times I thought it was a stupid idea, trust me. But it was never about me. It was never about us. The core team that helped started one church, it was never about that. So we all had churches that we were a part of. We chose to leave those situations to start something new for those who didn't have a church connection. Because we want to be a church with a fresh attitude, one of humility and love. Because here's the one thing I want us to walk away from here today. Pittsburgh needs humble churches. More than ever before, I think, on this planet. Our city needs humble churches. I have family and friends that want nothing to do with Jesus. So it creates really fun conversations when the pastor comes over. And a lot of the brokenness that I see has nothing to do with Jesus, but it has everything to do with how churches are sometimes. Now, I'm not blaming, I'm not pointing fingers at any other church around here. I told you there are churches around here that we love, that we're working with, that we're partnering with. It's a big deal for us to be in a city, in a community with other churches working for the same goals as us. But I also know that we can come with an attitude that doesn't help people know and trust who Jesus is. So more than ever, for new churches like One Church, like Brian Church, who taught here a couple weeks ago as they launched Tree Line here in a couple months in South Fayette, as Tony Salva is working to start new churches, that's his job now. He helps start new churches in the northeast area of our country. These churches have to be humble. We have to be humble with the same attitude as Jesus. The way we are as a church has to be a humble church, an attitude like Jesus where we put others first. We don't have to have it all together. We never will. But we have to look to the interests of others and say, listen, this gospel, this trust we have in Jesus, it leads us to this life that we don't have it all figured out together, but I'm telling you, this is the life that God has for you. Trust me on this as we're trying to figure this out together. It leads us to look out to their interests of knowing God. It can't be led by pride or arrogance. It has to be led by humility. We have to be leading by humility by serving others and giving up our time and our resources to serve other people, both inside these walls where we're gathering on Sunday mornings and outside these walls as we're meeting people in the community. We have to be living in a way that serves others like Jesus did, and we have to be willing to sacrifice for others like Jesus did as well. Now, thankfully, we live in a country where we're able to be freely spoken about meeting as a church and being that. So our lives aren't really at risk by having a faith in Jesus. But doesn't mean we don't sacrifice. Doesn't mean we don't give up some of our pleasures, some of our own personal belongings, some of our own resources in our own time for other people. We live in a way with an attitude of Jesus where we put others first, where we serve, we sacrifice. We do this because of who Jesus is and what he's done. You see, church is not about rules, but about a person. It's about Jesus, and that Jesus led with humility, and that's what we're supposed to do too. And when we do this, we become the church calls the Philippians to be here in 2018 with One Church. A church that puts others first, that has the same attitude of Jesus. And when we do that, I'm convinced that relationships that take place outside of this room that we meet on Sunday mornings, they'll grow, they'll get stronger. And we have an opportunity as a church to go connect with other people and say, listen, I don't have it all figured out, but I know this Jesus guy that brings life like you wouldn't believe. Why don't you come explore him with me? And we can live in a way that invites people into that with us on Sunday mornings and outside of here as well. And that's what we're called to do. So when Paul says, dear church, this is how you live, he's saying, dear One Church, what you need to be is a humble church. Because that's who Jesus is. And that's what Pittsburgh needs. Let's pray. Father God, thanks so much for today and a chance to come together to worship, to hang out, to talk, to meet new people, to talk with old friends, God, but to explore who you are and what you're all about. And God, you are a God of humility. You sent Jesus and he lived in a way that put others first. He served, he sacrificed his own life, even death in a humiliating way on a cross. He didn't have to, but he chose to for the sake of others. So he could show who you were to them and to us. God, help us to live the same way as individuals and as a church. And God, help One Church and every other church here across our city be a humble church. That God, the people who are so against maybe the idea of who you are, because maybe how we've acted in the past, God, that they start being transformed and changed and their minds start changing because we change. That we come with humility. We're not expecting them to change, God. We change ourselves to be humble in our relationship and our approach with them so they can see and experience who you are and how much you love them. And we pray that for us as a church and for this city. In Jesus we pray. Amen.